Bienvenue à la première après-midi du Joomla Défense à Metz, où nous accueillons pour la deuxième fois aujourd'hui Benjamin Trenkle. Bravo. Il va nous parler du workflow, le workflow Joomla, le flux de travail.
Yes. So first sound check. Do you hear me in the back row? I mean, yeah, on the front you hear me. Yes.
Yeah, but I knew it.
Okay. Whoever used the workflow or have an idea or looked into it at least. Okay. So it's good that you are here. So let's start. The Joomla 4 publishing workflow had a long history before it was implemented in Joomla. And as you followed probably the initial session from me, I talked about Google Sum of Code. And the publishing workflow was also a Google Sum of Code project. And I was their mentor. It was my first year as mentor there with a student. And we built it 3 or 4 years before Joomla 4 came out. And we built it in a really basic version that we had a publishing workflow where you can publish and unpublish stuff. And the question is, why did we build it? So you have this use case, someone is writing an article and someone else is publishing, which is no problem in Joomla, right? So you have a manager and you have an author in your system, and they both interact. And we asked ourselves, is this enough? And so you can think of, the answer is probably not if you would like to have more complex publishing workflows, like you have a writer, then someone who confirms that the text is what we want, and you have a proofreader to correct the mistakes. Then you confirm again, and then you publish. It's still somehow possible with Joomla, but it gets complex, especially if you have something like that. You're out of the picture with Joomla. At least with Joomla 3 core, it's rather hard to implement something like that. And this is the idea why we implemented the workflow. And I would go away from theory and just directly go in the live session to show how it's implemented, where you find the workflow, and probably what you can do. So this is Joomla. Someone didn't see it yet. And the workflow in general is a generic implementation. That means you could implement in any extension you want. But for the core, we only implemented for com content yet. Probably it comes more, but it's most of the time you use it for articles. And by default, the workflow is disabled for reasons. You have to enable it. So you go, it was too fast, you go on the options here, top right. And in the integration tab on the very bottom, you have here the enable workflow options where you enable it. For your information, the workflow itself is always active in the background. So although you disable it, the important information the workflow needs, if you enable it later, are always covered. So you don't have to fear if you enable, disable, enable, it doesn't matter. You can test it, you can disable and enable later. Joomla is fine with it. The first thing you see probably here is that you have a new stage. And this is the concept of the workflow. We have stages, and you know from Joomla we have a status. The status tells you if the article is published, unpublished, trashed, or archived. This is just an attribute of the article. The workflow itself, you can think about an extra level above your article, where it just runs above your article and manipulates your article when you're working in. And to show this, on the left side of the menu, we have now a new menu item, workflows, where Joomla is shipped with a basic workflow. But let's create our own to see the full potential. The workflow itself is just a container where all the informations, all the actions, everything is saved. So let's call it Joomla Day front workflow. And as you know, you can set up permissions who can edit this workflow. And you have here a little default toggle where you can define if an article is created and no workflow is defined for it, then this workflow will be used. So we can here, for example, say, okay, by default, please use our Joomla Day workflow. And see here the star. We can switch to the basic workflow back and come here. Now we see here two informations which are the concept of the workflow. First are stages and transitions. You can think the workflow is a big empty box on a paper. And stages are dots on this in this box where I say, okay, it's new, it's ready for proofreading, it's something where the article is in without having any influence. And transitions is when you now draw connections between these dots. You say, okay, when it's new, then someone has to put in a picture. Then this would be transition to a new status, which is then pictures needs proofreading, for example. So the first thing you do normally is you go into stages, you click on this, let's go back, you click on this box here, then you go to stages, you have a basic stage, you can rename this. And here's the second thing you can see. It's multilingual. So you can either type in hard code my stage, that's fine. But as you can see, you can also put in language strings, which you can later, I'm not sure if you notice, but let's do a little off topic. If you go on system, and then you go on language overrides, you can define your own language strings on the fly in the system for each language you have installed. So you can here set up your stage names, whatever you want, and can use these language strings. It looks like that, where I put in here a constant, workflow test, for example, and then you can put in the translations test and say for both locations, so it's back and front end. And then you have here a language strings, and you would do it, of course, for all your languages you have. And then we can go back to the workflow in our stage and, for example, rename this to test. And if you save, we see here the preview, what it is in our language. And if we would have more languages, you would see all language translations here. We have also a node, which is a node for you. It's not really used in the workflow, it's just for you. So we have the first stage, but let's start, let's say we have new, needs proofreading, and we have published. So we have the three statuses. And here again, we have a default, which means when this workflow is started, this is the first status, the stage the article is in. So if you create an article for this workflow, then it's by default new. And then we can start working it with the transitions, which is the next steps. So let's go to the transitions. And now we are building this connections and say, okay, we call one ask for proofreading. And this means we go from new to needs proofreading, right? And now there are different options. And I show you later how this works with the plugins. But based on the workflow plugins you have activated, you now have, you can execute, but you don't have to, different options. So in our case, we create one, it's unpublished. Now we ask for proofreading. It should still be unpublished, so we don't change the state, we don't change the feature state. We are all fine. What we can do is we can send out a notification. That means everyone who can now execute further will then get a notification, say, click here on the link to take actions, whatever has to be done. And we can select who should get these notifications by users or by user groups. And then, of course, we can set up permissions, who is allowed to execute this transition. So, for example, the use case here is that this is a normal workflow, so we go for new to needs proofreading. But sometimes you have a boss who said, I don't care about proofreading. I do perfect text, so I create new and then just publish it. So you can create an extra transition for your boss, who only your boss has access, or your customer, or whoever. And for other people, you can create different ways to come to the same goal. So, yeah.
Like question, Why didn't use the email template system for notification?
Because the workflow is older. That's the only reason.
Okay.
So the email templates were not there yet when we had the workflow. But it should be an improvement, of course, which would be nice. So let's do another one from needs proofreading to published. And here now we say, okay, we would like to publish the article. So when this transition is executed, we set the publish state to published. And now we can also do additional connections. For example, we could say featured. And we can say, okay, from everywhere, I probably need a new stage in here. It doesn't matter. Needs proofreading. So from everywhere, we can go to needs proofreading with this transition. And this transition features the article. So this means if you see if it's already published, then it still stays published because we don't change the status, but the stage of the workflow changes. So we have the stage, needs proofreading again. But we can also combine it and say, okay, if someone features this article, we also want automatically to unpublish it again to go the proofreading process. And in fact, that's it. You set up this workflow, and now we have to get the workflow connected with your articles. And there were different ways to do this. One way would be, of course, you create an article and you decide which workflow would you like to have the article in. Works for small sites, but not if you have many authors, because authors does not have the knowledge to know which workflow works best for them, because they have only limited scope, most likely permission-wise. So what we decided is that we can go to categories and assign the workflow to the category. So we tell for each category which workflow should be used if you put an article here. And that's here again, the use default comes into the game. So by default, it's the default workflow. We can use inherit, which means if the category has a parent category, we just take over what is defined in the parent category, like the inherit system in the permission level or inherit system in the parameters. Or we can use an explicit workflow. We say, okay, for this category, we use the basic workflow or we use the Joomla de France workflow, which we're doing now. So let's save. And now let's go to the article and create one. And here you see, just because, so different things happens here. First, you can't select the status anymore because the workflow takes over this responsibility. Otherwise, it would be meaningless to have a workflow if everyone could change status. So changing the status only works now via the workflow. And the same for feature option, only works if you have the workflow. And here you see now that the new article is in the default state new, and now we could run transitions on it when we save. But let's create a new one. Let's say test workflow. Let's save it. And now there are two options. And as you remember, we said, okay, ask for proofreading. We'll go to proofreading. But we also had a second transition where we said we want to feature it. So we can select now one, ask for proofreading, and save. Okay, because I didn't set up a user to get a message. But the article is saved, and now we are in the new state, need proofreading. And you see here, now the transitions change. Now I can publish it or I can feature it again, because the feature can be done from everywhere. Of course, it's not always makes sense to go into the article itself. So we have here also the option to run transition here and just say, okay, let's publish it. And now it's published. And you see here, we can't click on I'm clicking here now. We can't click on the status to unpublish here because workflow is blocking it. And also featuring is not happening. And if you now say, okay, feature it, you see it's unpublished because we set up that it should be unpublished if you run it, and the feature is set there. And of course, sometimes you have the situation that you are stuck or that you have a new workflow and the old workflow is outdated. And if you're a super user in your system, and really you have to be a super user, you can use the batch functionality, to jump as super user between the workflows around. So if you say, okay, this article is in the wrong workflow, you just can switch it to another workflow, or can reset it to new, for example. And the last thing is, you can also here on actions, it automatically gives you the transitions you need. So if I go now here, for example, you see there are other transitions because this is the base workflow which is shipped with Joomla, which reflects the publishing methods we have in Joomla 3. So you can either feature, unfeature, publish, unpublish, and do things. And what I built also is that you can change permissions, but I didn't activate it here yet. So you could remove, for example, edit access, because the biggest problem, in my opinion, is when an article is so someone edits the article and say, okay, it's great, give it to someone to publish, and then the person still can go in and change the article, although it's published on the web page. And for example, if you have a publishing plugin to block this out, you can just remove the permissions when it gets a certain transition executed. But this is not in core, this is a plugin I'm playing around, which I probably plan to have in 5.0. Let's see if it works out. And now this is the keyword. Any questions so far? Okay.
So you can make the access rules even more separate.
Yes.
You can edit an article, but only until it's published.
For example, yes. And then the new, so let me go to the plugins. We have here a new type in Joomla 4. It's called workflow. And these 3 published modules are responsible for featuring, sending out notification, and publishing handling. So if I say, okay, I don't want the workflow to do featuring, then I can disable just a plugin. And if I go back now here to my article list, then I can start featuring and unfeaturing again, because I don't have the plugin activated. And the idea of this permission one was, if you enable it and you go into an article, okay, it's not here. Then the permissions here would be disabled if it's integrated, and you would set up the permissions in the transition, how it should act after you execute it. Yes.
Can we get back to the article view? On the article test workflow before, it was published, and then you made something with some modifications, and it became not published.
Yes.
So what happened in the front end? Can I see another version of it, or does the article disappear?
The article that's the real normal publishing status, which is manipulated. Instead of you manipulate it as author, it's the workflow. But in fact, in theory, of course, it does not. But in fact, it opens a drop down and select unpublished. That's what's happening here. So it's nothing extra, nothing special. The workflow itself is super stupid. It does nothing, and then you have plugins who really change the parameters of the article. So for example, you could, I saw plugins where they cut the intro images, for example. So someone uploads intro image, and you know your customer, they do 2 megabytes, 5,000 pixel images in, and then you run a transition which cuts it and decreases the size and saves it in. So the idea is really workflow is running parallel, and then you have a plugin who grabs really the article and change stuff, or change headlines, or run ChatGPT over it, or whatever you can think. Of course, you need a plugin for it, and then you can do it. And let me go back to plugins. The plugins itself also have different options. In this case, they're very easy. So you can decide if you have many components which would support the workflow. You can decide what components should be used there. So if you would have more than one, then you can really decide, okay, publishing plugin should not be in this component, but in another component, and really configure it.
Can you, for example, apply the workflow to the custom fields? Creation of custom fields?
Would be possible, yes. Again, it's the plugin is the powerful thing here. if you can reach it somehow via PHP, and in most cases you can, you could do it. Also, like enforcing custom fields on certain statuses. So before it's not required, and suddenly it becomes required, because currently your custom field can only be required every time or never. And with the workflow, you could, of course, and here we are talking about programming. Then you have to program it, but we could do so. Okay, it's not required till we reach ready for publishing. Then it needs to be filled out. Also, like this image example, I built for some customer plugin where when the designer comes into play and has to put in an intro image, then the intro image becomes required for him, and for everyone else not. Yeah, this is the general how the workflow works. So now the question is, I have prepared a bit about how the programming flow works, if someone is interested in, or if you want to see something else on the workflow. Then let's do programming. Oh yeah, questions? Okay, so
Sorry, but the same question about email templating and this feature. It's very strange. We didn't have for other components. We didn't have any documentation to use it and integrate it in other components. It's very damaged because we have it on core, but we can use. It's very difficult to read all code only to use this feature.
yes. Let me see. Yeah, nothing here, but we have Joomla. Yes, so we have here from, I guess it's from Roland, wrote an implementation. How this works, at least on a theoretical thing. So yeah, there's in the documentation is a kind of starting explanation, but yeah, documentation is still
I know
missing.
it's difficult
Yeah.
to do this, but sometimes we can be frustrated by.
I know. Yeah, as you can see, it's 6 years ago when we started with it. Yes. Yeah, I can't help here. It's really I can only recommend to look into content, how it's implemented. It's really traits. If you say something for you, using a lot of traits just on certain areas, and then it happens nearly automatically. And I guess this was a lie, but yeah. But yeah, it's really putting in. We have these classes, which really the workflow happens in the background. This is all there. You just have to activate it in your component by using these traits and calling them. If you're interested, I can show you after talk a bit of the code where to look. Okay. Okay. So how does the workflow works? So the workflow implements 2 new trigger points where you can listen with your plugins. Does someone not know how the concept of the plugins works in Joomla? Give it a little. So the idea is we have names for, let's call it hooks. So they're just hooks which calls a name. And if your plugin has a method which also is named like that, then it's run the code. So with Joomla 4 it's a bit more complex, but that's the baseline. So you just have a plugin which have the same name in it, and then it's run this code, whatever it is. And there are 2 new names. It's on workflow before transition. So if someone executes transition, this first name will be executed. So all the plugins which listen, that's the name here, for this event will do their stuff. Then the stuff itself happens, and then the after transition hook is done. And the example here is if we publish and unpublish an article. The problem with publishing and unpublishing is in Joomla, it's really a method which is there. So just because we activate a plugin, it's not removed, right? So if you're a bit of a coder, you can still execute this publishing and unpublishing stuff just with manual coding, having the right URL and stuff like that. You can just skip over it. And the idea here is that we block with our plugin, with our publishing plugin, all the execution of this code. But, and now here comes the challenge, we don't want to block it if we execute it as workflow. So on before, that's why we have before, we so to speak allow to now change the status, and after we then change the status. So we have always a before which validates if everything is fine, and afterwards to executing the stuff. So here's a summary, and also things like preparing data. So if you say the intro image is a required field now for our transition, you check before if the data is correct and the data is the one you expect. Otherwise, you can stop the execution of this transition. And after, then you would execute your changes and clean up. So for example, if you call an API, if you download data, it's all possible. You should clean it up at the end that nothing is left. And that's it, to be honest. So it's really easy, easy bit programming wise, that you really have two code snippets in your plugin, one before and one after, and you have to put in your needs what has to be done. That's the general idea of how workflow plugins work. And I think at the beginning I got a lot of questions where people said, you know, I write 2 articles per year, and the workflow is for bigger agencies, right? And with many customers. But in fact, workflow is not about workflow, but it's about how you do things without thinking about it. Because if you set up the workflow in a correct way with plugins and stuff like that, you can really streamline your process. So you really prevent failures. So you go to your customer and say, okay, here's an article, create. And if you set up the workflow correctly, everything is disabled in this step, which the customer should not touch. And you really give them then a few options, and especially with the guided tour now, probably you heard about it, that we have a guided tour in Joomla 4.3, where people can guide through the process. You can combine it. You have a workflow and at the same time a guided tour. And yeah, you don't have to train your customer anymore. You just set up the system, so he is restricted everywhere where he or she should be restricted, and you give an explanation with the guided tour. And then you copy paste it to all your customer systems. And that's the idea behind this. Yeah. This would be the presentation about the workflow.
Maybe tell about the recent Google Summer of Code project, the scheduled task, connected with scheduled task, or is it not?
Yeah, it's not implemented. It didn't make it. Let me go into the backend. The idea and scheduled task was also where I was mentor. About scheduled task is that you can simulate cron jobs in your system without having cron jobs. And the idea was really that we auto-execute transitions in the workflow. So you have an article, and one day before Christmas, it's published up, and after Christmas, it's published down. And probably on Christmas, it's featured. And that's why we built the task scheduler, where you can also with plugins do automatic execution of things. Currently, you will see that we have image resizing, where you give a folder and then the customer uploads the images and you just resize them on a regular base. So once per day, you resize all the new images all day. Or you ping a GET request for example, where you ping your website, and if it's down, you get an email notification. So the base examples here are really demo, to be honest. But you can set up your site online and offline. So if we have updates every 6 weeks. So you can set your site offline, you can then update, and then you can set it online and automatically in the future when we have the automated updates, for example. And that's the idea behind this task. And the base idea was that we have the workflow and can combine it, but we invested so much time in that we couldn't make it with the workflow yet. We'll see if it's in the future, or if someone says, yeah, I'm interested in it and want to implement it. So as you can see, we have a lot of potential to improve still.
J'ai jamais réussi à faire fonctionner les contrôles. Nativement, quand on installe Joomla, il y a un workflow, article, publié, non publié, poubelle, etc. Et je voudrais juste rajouter une fonction article publié et comment dire, édité et publié à un groupe.
So you never really
There is both stages in Joomla, there is published, whatever. They just want to add a specific one saying that it's published to a certain group.
Okay, the access level. It's not there yet, but it's possible. Again, with the plugin, with your plugin, you would need a plugin for it. Then it's possible, yes.
Maybe you can do it because when you have a demonstration about the workflow, you show us that there is some there is an option. Maybe you can go to the workflow and edit one. Okay, and position, and here you have the permission. So maybe you can have
that's my
workflow and change the permission between two workflows, and maybe you can
yes. But this is only for transition itself. So you can allow someone to execute a transition with it, but not set the permission of an article.
Ah, ok. Donc en fait, non, pour l'instant, c'est pas encore possible. Je pensais qu'on pouvait détourner en fait, le truc par rapport à la permission. Non, ça fonctionne pas comme ça.
En fait, ce qui m'embête, c'est que dans le workflow natif de Joomla, je voudrais rajouter une dernière étape qui serait l'article, informer simplement par un email un groupe en disant un nouvel article est publié, et pas utiliser Assimailing pour faire envoyer des emails, etc. Et juste informer la dernière étape, tu sais, rajouter sur la dernière étape, une dernière étape, article publié, distribué.
Okay, so the objective is to send a notification to a certain group when an item is published. So you want to use the normal workflow, and at the end, when the article is published, you want to send a notification to a group.
Yeah, this is possible here by sending this notification. But, and here a very big but, this only works for user who has access to backend currently.
Compris. En fait, c'est possible de le faire avec une notification, mais en fait, c'est que ceux qui ont accès au backend.
Oui, c'est ça. Et moi, c'est pas le backend qui m'intéresse.
Ah, ben non,
c'est envoyer un mail, dire juste un mot.
C'est que ceux qui ont un niveau spécial. En fait.
Et ouais, mais tu vas toquer sur un autre truc, c'est qu'il va envoyer un email. Là où est-ce qu'Assimailing va envoyer un email à toutes les personnes qui sont là, le système envoie un email à tout le monde. En délivrabilité, c'est pas la même action. C'est pour ça que tu vois, Assimailing, c'est pour ça que ton couple avec Assimailing, si tu as beaucoup d'utilisateurs, ça va être plus efficace que si tu essaies de le faire via Joomla parce qu'il risque d'envoyer un email à 200 personnes en copie. Et là, tu passes.
Here is a pull request who opens up this notification it just needs tests to send really emails, and it could also use email templates, but I'm not sure if it use email templates. So if enough people test this, it would be a feature for 4.3 is too late, but for 5.0, which is end of this year. Just people have to test it. And then you can have email templates and sending email templates to certain people.
I propose this, I not further, I just propose the idea and Roland
Okay.
try to propose.
So yeah, it's there, it just needs some love from people to
Need contest.
and more tester. So there's a lot of feedback. Yeah. So he blocked it. Yeah.
Oops.
Yeah, but again, it's that's how Joomla works. If people are interested and invest their time, then it will make it.
I think we need more pizza bugs and fun events.
Yes.
But maybe the best solution is to develop a plugin with ACY mailing and to take the hook
Yeah.
after the publication, you will send the ACY mailing.
That's also possible, yes.
Développer un plugin qui soit compatible avec les workflows et qui envoie les racines. Et à partir du moment où ton article est publié, en fait, tu peux l'envoyer à une liste parce que
Déjà avec les actions, hein. Parce que si Mailing est capable de le faire avec ses actions dans les dernières.
ouais, peut-être. Ouais. Une mass action.
En fait, pour moi, c'est éviter d'utiliser la simulation.
Ah, ouais,
Parce que je veux.
c'est un autre débat.
Parce que c'est pour éviter qu'il y ait une multitude de composants, qu'il n'y ait pas image, qu'il n'y ait pas. Moi, je veux juste une notification qui te dit un nouvel article a été publié sur le site joomla.fr. Point. C'est tout.
Ouais.
C'est juste ce mot-là, quoi. C'est la dernière étape. Parce que si tu publies un article sur Joomla, tu n'es pas informé.
Parce que là, tu peux aussi utiliser le mail de masse des users. En fait, dans la partie user, il y a un système de fonction batch. Tu peux envoyer un email groupé. Tu peux aussi. Et là, tu n'as pas besoin de la
Ouais, je sais.
Ouais,
Mais,
je te montre le reste.
en fait, c'est passer la dernière étape et dire toc toc, il y a un nouvel article.
Ouais,
Tu la signes à une user,
ouais, c'est ça, un groupe. Ouais.
And regarding this access level, I just thought about it. I would just copy the publishing and replace all the publishing fields with access field. And then you have the same and rename it, of course, from publishing to access. Then you have your functionality to change access levels via the workflow. So, yeah. So you just search for publishing. It's 14 times. And yeah, it should be easier because we don't have an access level button, so we don't need this functionality either on the list. It's just inside access level deactivating and setting it via workflow. Would be a nice project.
There is a lot of comments.
Yeah, we try to document it okay-ish, I would say. It's not perfect, but it's the most important stuff is commented to see why we're doing stuff like that. And yeah, here are dragons. But here you see our on workflow before transition. So we allow, set here a status that we allow to change statuses. And after, then we boot the component and set the real value. And here publish it then. So that's the way it works. And here we also suppress then all the normal publishing of the workflow and say, no, you're not allowed to change normal status without workflow. And you have to do it, of course, on different, so we do the same on different areas, like on saving, on pressing the button or using the menu. You have to, of course, to catch all the options where it is possible to do it the old way. Yeah. Good. Any more questions? Then thank you.
Thank you.